Hello, welcome to Life with God. Tonight is episode 11 of Life with God in season 1, studying the love of God. And our topic this evening is going to be God's love in the community, more specifically, how we can reflect the love of God in our surrounding communities. Our special guest this evening comes from Andrews University. Her name is Stacie Hatfield, and she is a PhD candidate in cultural anthropology at University of Kentucky. She's also assistant professor of anthropology in the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences, and she's also program director of behavioral sciences at Andrews. Welcome, Stacie. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation. It's so good to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Also part of the discussion, as usual, we have 4 students. Tonight we're joined by Kian, Nicola, Mark, and Ruth. Welcome back, everyone. Good to see you as well. And as you're already used to, for the first few minutes of the discussion, we'd love to get to know the guests. And so let's take a few minutes for that and see what we can discover. Where did you grow up?
My dad's an electrical engineer, and we traveled a lot with his job growing up. So I spent about half my growing up years in Missouri, about half the time overseas in other places.
Wow. Are you distantly related to anyone famous?
Not that I'm aware of. We tried to trace the Hatfield bit back a bit, but apparently, like, the family split, and I went. My husband's family went down the non feud side before the feud happened. So, other than the feud, somebody once thought I was related to a Hatfield, who was a drummer with Motley Crue or something, but it turns out that wasn't Hatfield. So, no such luck.
A favorite book other than the Bible?
Favorite book other than the Bible? We have some theological differences, and we have some time of life differences, but I love Miracles by C.S. Lewis. I'm also a huge Tolkien fan. I love Lord of the Rings and all its versions.
What do you like to do in your free time?
I like to play guitar and ride motorcycle and garden and be with people.
What are some of your grounding spiritual practices?
Grounding spiritual practices. I spend 45 minutes to an hour reading, meditating every day. I do that in the bathtub because that's the best place for peace and quiet. And also, like, you got to get cleaned up anyway. Lately, stress has driven me to, I have an app, I have a meditation app that reminds me a couple times a day. It's really lovely. It's through Ransomed Heart Ministries. And it's just to take some deep breaths and scripture verses and God saying that I'm with you. And those right now have been really good practices. Hiking and walking often are good practices for me too.
Awesome.
Stacie, this could take a while, but if you could be invisible for one day, what would you do?
I could be invisible for one day.
Or maybe a place you would go.
A place I would go where something I would want to see that nobody would know I was seeing. Yeah, I don't know. Let me think. If I could be invisible for one day, I might just like slip around and do all the peace and quiet things that you can't do because somebody already sees you there and asks you to do things. Or
Fair enough.
Very sociable. I really love people. So being invisible would mean that I could be with people, but also like be about my own business. I don't know. Well, my research means that a lot of times I go places that I wouldn't expect to have been. I've found myself in remarkable places, and not through being invisible, but through being visible. And I think especially, I was talking with someone just the other day about cybersecurity or insecurity, and the idea of that we're somehow always visible or always being heard. And I'm like, I don't have the energy or what it takes to, or the technical, expertise to try to block all of that. My thought is, make the show worth watching, if they're.
Okay, thank you.
That's great. My question is, what does the gospel mean to you in your everyday life?
The gospel means Jesus. It means good news, right? And the good news is that he loved us before we knew him. He loved us while we were still sinners. He is with us. He promised never to leave us, and he's coming back. And that is good news. That's the good news.
Is there a food item you think everyone should try at least once?
Oh, well, I can't imagine anyone not liking mangoes. So anybody who hasn't tried a mango should do that. I haven't tried durian. And I would like to try durian. I've been in Asia several times and lived there even to where I should have maybe had the opportunity, but didn't. I like to eat. So I think people should enjoy the things they taste.
What was your favorite subject in undergraduate school?
So my first anthropology came to me as a second degree, as a bit of a do-over. I studied nursing first time around, and I'm still a nurse. I worked as a nurse for a long time, and that was good. It felt like school. It was fine. I like taking care of people. I enjoy people. But when I found anthropology, it changed everything for me, and I've loved anthropology since.
So, you've been to various places, you've lived in various countries. What's one that you just always want to get back to whenever you can?
We were in and out of London quite a bit. I've never lived there, but we visited there. We were frequently there on the way back and forth to other places, and so London always feels familiar to me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stacie, and thanks to everyone else as well. I believe that our viewers will have enjoyed getting to know you a little bit. And also a big welcome to those who are watching, whether live or after the stream. If you are live at the moment, we invite you to communicate with us as usual with questions and comments on YouTube or streaming. We're also monitoring the Facebook for Adventist Theological Society. So if you cannot communicate via YouTube, you're also welcome to comment on Facebook under the link to the live stream. We're monitoring that as well, and we would love to make room for you in the discussion as always. Moving into our topic, Stacie, I'm extremely intrigued by this, just because we have a social scientist with us, and I know there's so much wisdom we can glean from communicating with you, from hearing from you. So I'm super excited about this topic, and you as a guest. And so my kind of two-part question for tonight is, first of all, let's learn something about communities. It's a word that we use often in many contexts, especially today in postmodernism. It's such a big word. And we never really quite pause to ask ourselves, what do we mean by community? What are communities? And so if you could help us with that aspect, what are communities? How do they form? What are their functions? To begin with. And then, of course, throughout the conversation, I would love for us to, as a group, to move into the question of how we can love our communities, how we can reflect God's love in the community, and also why. Why should we love? Why should we have this principle in our interaction with our communities?
So the first question, would you like me to start there?
Yes, please.
So cultural anthropology, I should maybe start there a little bit. So anthropology, there are four major subfields to anthropology. One is archaeology. Many people are familiar with archaeology. One is biological anthropology, which studies human culture. All of anthropology studies human beings, studies often human culture, but it studies what the human experience. Biological anthropology studies the human experience often through the human body, studies the history of what it means to be human. Biological anthropology is often evolutionarily based. It's primarily evolutionarily based. As much as we need believing geologists and believing microbiologists and believing chemists, we need believing biological anthropologists. I haven't met one yet because it's not a field that we have focused on, but it is a need that we have. So that's the second subfield: archaeology, biological anthropology, linguistics. We think about how we use language socially to tell you who I am, my tone of voice, the words that I might choose. Am I bold or am I timid? Am I masculine? Am I feminine? Language, and how we use it to construct power differentials between each other. Often also through tone of voice, but through our choice of words. And we're very familiar with the ways that we're able to lift each other up or put each other down or keep each other in line. And so those are three of the fields. The fourth is cultural anthropology. And cultural anthropology studies human culture and human diversity. All of anthropology studies human diversity, but cultural anthropology in particular. So we're looking at all people and all places and all times. for anthropology. And for me as a cultural anthropologist, part of what that means is part of the interesting part of that study, one of the most interesting parts, is this concept of human diversity, that the human experience looks different in different places and at different times and in different contexts with different histories. And so what community means to me may be different from what community means to you or what it means in another part of the world. I'm a white cisgender woman. I was raised in many ways in the United States, but also internationally. I have a background as a nurse, so I have a background in medical history. So when we talk about care, I've just recently developed care as an analytic framework that I'm using for my dissertation. And at first I was just like, ugh, I spent a lot of years in care and I know it can be a dysfunctional place. But there's also a framework of care that's incredibly community, not community-based, but that thinks much more broadly about caring for, caring about, the actual act of caregiving. It can have a very activist potential and very much more engaged potential, far beyond just the healthcare context. So what does it mean? What does it mean to be in community in different places in different times? Who am I, and how does who I am shape my understandings of what community means? I study intersections of race and gender in the United States, and those factors impact very much our understandings of community and our experiences of community. Often when we think about community, we think about the community service center, or we think about the church community, or we think about the community outside of the church, the communities around us, but who are not us, right? So it's very bounded. It's either geospatially bounded by the buildings that are around us, or it's bounded on the landscape. We can see the edges of Andrews University. We can see where Andrews University ends and the village of Berrien Springs begins. So we think about it in this bounded sort of way. The people that we know at church, or the people that we're in community with at Thanksgiving, when we're with family, or the people that we work with maybe who aren't part of our church community. So we think of it by groups. And I think that I would like to propose that rather than thinking of community as something that's bounded geographically or bounded by groups, we think of community as processes of relationship. So that when I say I live in a community, I'm not saying I live in Berrien Springs. When I say I live in community, it means that I live in relationship with you. And when you and I live in relationship with each other, that there's something that grows out of that is just much more, it's much more alive, it's more dynamic than any other form of community. And I think that that's a form of community that's very reflective of community that happens with God, that God is a triune God, and always in communication and in relation and in this undulating of crowning and serving and lifting up and surrendering that happens continually. We see this with Christ and with God the Father, and I think with the Spirit. And when we live in this dynamic process of community with each other, I think that that's one of the key ways that we can reflect the image of God in us as in a more collective sense.
So can we say then that we technically function within different types of communities at the same time, right, simultaneously, and then there are communities within communities, like some of them are smaller, some of them are broader. What would be the smallest unit that's considered a community? Because we're like last week we talked about family as a unit and how we can reflect God's love in the family. Now moving to the broader circle, what would define a community as opposed to other things, other groups?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So when we think about community in terms of groups, as in what would be the smallest unit, rather than thinking about it as in, well, there's this group that makes up this unit, or to say that right this minute, I'm in community with the five of you, we are in community, and also with the people who are on YouTube, the people who are on Facebook. We're sharing in this moment, this living, breathing moment of community. Now, as this live episode ends and we go our separate ways, then it's like turning down the light a little bit, putting on the dimmer switch on the sense of community that we had in this moment. So in that case, community can ebb and flow in time. As we spend time with someone, I can build community here with you. And then later, as I see you, maybe we'll pass on the sidewalk and I'll say, oh, hey, I remember you, Nicholas. Hey, Mark, and then we'll have a moment of community there. And then maybe when you're with your family. So, and then we have people that we spend time with more regularly. So maybe that strengthens it. But rather than thinking of community as having edges or groups, think of it as more porous and more as if something that's happening in real time and in real process, rather than something that can be defined as something that's static, as my family is these 5 people. No, my family is these 5 people, but these 5 people, as we talk to each other, I may talk to my mom more, and then that strengthens that, or I may be talking to my dad less, or we may all be sitting around the table, in which case all 5 of us are having this strong sense of community together. And rather than thinking of it as bounded, think of it as more in process.
So obviously having community is important for us, right? And I think as college students, we kind of long for a sense of community. But if we are imagining community not necessarily as like a solid set group of people, how do we go about creating community or the sense of community that we long for?
And can I just kind of jump on that? Because as I'm just listening to this conversation, I'm feeling like the way we're talking about community, which I mean, experientially, that makes sense. It's sort of like that inner sense of like, I can feel when I'm having community and when I'm not, kind of a thing. But I'm also struggling to see, how this differentiates from saying I'm currently in relationship with all of you. And so I'm wondering, is there actually even a difference between being in community with somebody and being in relationship? Is there a way where we can have community without relationship, or is that not even a possibility?
Right. Well, and of course, relationships can be positive or negative. So I can be with somebody, we all have people in our lives that we've known for a long time who have been in our community, in our circle of friends, but that we maybe don't really care for. Maybe we find them annoying, or there's just some anti-chemistry between us. We're just never going to be best friends with that person. And so, so then it's more difficult to kind of build a sense of community that way through that relationship, but we may still choose to care for them. If they get sick, we may still take them a casserole. If they need help picking up groceries, we may still do that. If something bad happens to them, we may still be concerned. So in that way, we can identify them as somebody who we're more regularly in contact with. And in that way, like, we can begin to imagine it having more, I wouldn't say not, hard boundaries, but we can imagine that we can identify, well, who are the people that you're in relationship more often? Well, maybe it's kind of a weird relationship, but man, I've known this kid for 20 years. I knew them when they were 5. We were weird friends back then, so it's somebody who you maybe have seen really regularly. And so then this becomes another way of deciding, thinking about community. And absolutely. So I'm aiming us in this kind of more abstract direction on purpose. Yeah. Because I think we often think about community services as in, what do we need to do then? What are the tasks that we need to do? And so then we can think about those tasks, or we think about who's in the community, who's out of the community, the us and them, the us versus them, or the who's saved, who's not saved, who do we need to work on? And there's this continual idea of the us or the them. And also, even in our own selves, there's a really wonderful work by C.S. Lewis. You can find it in the book, The Weight of Glory, but it's also called The Inner Ring. And it's the idea that all of us are longing to belong. And that we will, if we're not careful and if we're not intentional, we will spend our lives trying to belong. And we may be successful at it, we may not. It may lead us into being really good people and having really good friends. It may lead us to be scoundrels and to be evil. But if we chase that idea of belonging and wanting to be part of the inner ring, that will be the kind of person we are. And he says, resist the inner ring. Be with the people you like. Do the things that you enjoy, and you will accidentally create an inner ring that looks to all the world from the outside like a closed little knit group, but to the inside just feels like the people you like and the things you like to do. And so, so part of what I'm intending in talking about this more porous border, this process of relationship in community, is to begin to dissolve a bit this idea of us and them, or thus us or them, or this boundary between us and them. Because there's good theological reason to think that we are bound up with each other. God the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit are continually bound up with each other. And we are called into that. We are to think of each other as brothers and sisters. We're to think of each other as members of the same body. This is very much, I wrote it down because I didn't want to misquote it. So I think this is actually from Martin Luther King Jr., from his 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail. And this is a very famous quote. The first part of it you'll recognize. That injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And recently in the honors class, we were reading Emmanuel Levinas. And Levinas really critiques this idea of the same and other. How do I know who I am? He talks about this idea of the other as if I come into existence and you come into existence when we see each other's face. That part of recognizing each other, seeing each other, and that relationship that happens is what actually even brings us into being. And this is an abstract. He's a philosopher. This is an abstract idea, but it's very much one that's supported in the Bible too, where God says, "I see you, I know you," and that we can look at God and see that we know Him. And this is also a way in which we can say that God could look at us and say, "I don't know you." Like somehow there's a break. Like He looks at us, in the end, He looks at the goats and says, "Man, I don't know you." And so even that somehow in the seeing, there's something that happens between us. And for Levinas, the same and other, like we're co-constructed, we are bound together. We come into being through this relationship with each other. And so once again, back to my intent is to make us think more broadly about these dividing lines between us and them, between me and other, between this community and that community. And rather think about processes of relationship that bind us all together as human beings, as children of God, as brothers and sisters, as people who experience diverse kinds of human life that are bound together in lots of the same ways. We're all born, we all breathe air, we all have to eat food, we all sometimes are sick and injured. We all eventually, save for the coming of the Lord, will die. So there are experiences that bind us together across the diversity of human experience. And what are the things that allow us to develop richness and connection in that?
So from what I've just understand, are you saying more to the side that basically if you are a human, you are belong to a community? Is it more of the way? Then you quoted C.S. Lewis about the resistance of the inner ring and like look for a more natural way of like you just belong to a person who you are more used to and you have a better relationship and you will have that inner ring. But like I found myself, and especially from my cultural background, I belong to a really strong community, like the natural community, the one that you are used to, like the one with the with the boundary. So I'm from more of those kind of culture, and it's very strong. And like I tried to resist it because I saw the problem of what you have just told us, like because we start to have that same and different and like in and out. But then it's just so natural for me to just, it's easier for me and to belong to person who are more similar and have similar culture, and it's just so natural to have like that, like I'm in and it's hard to get close to you. So how can we, is that wrong? Is that a sin to do that?
I don't think that's necessarily wrong. It's just a thing. I think it can be wrong and it cannot be wrong. And I don't mean that in an entirely relativistic way. So my grandchild is here visiting, and she's just getting ready to turn a year old. Maybe I should choose a different example. It's going to make me a little teary. And that is when she knows me, and she's just beginning to know me, and we are good friends. And when she knows me and she's just little, and I grab her up and put her in my arms, and she snuggles in, and she feels safe, and she feels warm, and she knows that I'm going to love her and take good care of her. That is such a good feeling. And we all need that. We all need that. Whether we're married or single, whether we're young or whether we're old, whether we're far away from our family, whether we're near to our family. Sometimes it can be incredibly lonely with people in a group. Sometimes you can be with a group of people who should know you, who you should feel warm and safe and cared for in their presence. And somehow we don't. It can be terribly lonely. So I think when you feel that, it's wonderful. That is a gift. That's what we're supposed to feel in the presence of God, is that we are loved, we are cared for, we are safe, we are known, we know how to behave, we know what to expect. I think this will be one of the great comforts of heaven, right? But we don't want to live there all the time, because we have to remember that we live in a broken world, and that for every moment that I feel safe and warm and cared for, of course, there are going to be moments in my own life where I feel maybe not safe, or that I feel very alone, or maybe that I feel uncared for. And for every moment that I feel that, everyone else may feel that too. So especially in those moments where I feel very safe and cared for, then I have a well of empathy, right? I have the bandwidth, I have the energy, I have the strength, I have the reserve to then offer that to someone else who may not be feeling it in that moment.
I totally resonate with that. First of all, when you're talking about that reservoir and getting that, for me, that's like at home or with like a certain group of friends. Afterwards, I actually feel like recharged. But with some, it may not be as like evident that that's the case. But here's kind of a question that I'm having. I'm still kind of wrestling with the more abstract, definition here. But within the more porous structure, is there a benefit still to those boundaries? Because the thing I'm still struggling with is, if I think sometimes, can boundaries be good? Because I would suggest that sometimes they can be good in even modifying behavior in a good way. Is there still room for those boundaries in the more porous model?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Boundaries are essential. Now, I grew up in a time when you weren't talking about boundaries. Boundaries are a bit of a newer idea, as in probably for most of you guys, you're familiar with the ideas of boundaries. But there wasn't as much talk about it. So when we're talking about boundaries, we're talking about keeping ourselves safe. We're talking about keeping each other safe. And we're talking about when something happens that is inappropriate or is unsafe or is damaging, that not only do we just like get our feathers up and be like, whoa, boundary's been crossed, but then somebody says, okay, wait, a boundary has been crossed. Let's talk about what happened here, and let's solve this so this doesn't happen again, because we're ideally in an ideal community, we're not going to allow people that we're in relationship to be hurt. And whether that means I'm at work at the hospital and I see a nurse that I don't know being berated by a manager, or being in a conflict, maybe with a physician or somebody that maybe I don't even know her, but at that point I can go and stand beside her so that she's not alone in that moment. So in that way, I've created we're creating a boundary to say, this verbal abuse that's happening is not going to happen here. And this can happen at church when we're in a potluck line And we have a guest who says, they thought they were contributing. They brought something to potluck and it's got some turkey or some chicken or some tuna in it. And somebody says, oh, well, there's a little turkey or chicken in there. Then, this created this conflict. So then I can say, here's the question is this a boundary of food or is this a boundary of how we're treating each other? And I can say, oh, I recognize that somebody's being hurt. Somebody's about to be hurt because the food that they thought that they were bringing and were generous in bringing is about to be like discarded. And I can say, oh, hey, I like a little turkey with my macaroni and I can put a spoonful on my plate, and in that way I can create some boundaries to say, we're not going to treat each other that way here. And so those boundaries are really important for keeping each other safe. And they also create that sense of community, right? I'm taking care of you because I'm in relationship with you, because like I'm the elbow and you're my fingers. And so I need to take care of you. And, this is a biblical sense, right? Whether I know you or whether I don't, whether I'm in relationship with you all the time or whether I'm not, what is my sense of like, how am I going to take care of the people around me? And then what people do I say, maybe I don't even know this person, but for me, community means taking care of people when they're about to get hurt or when I see something happening that for me is like out of bounds. It's out of bounds for people to treat each other badly. So when I see that happening, then I need to find a way to say, hey, we're not going to do that here. So absolutely, boundaries are important. Yeah.
So when you just said that, like you can make the boundary, like from what authority, like who, like it takes a lot of effort, or at least like you need to be brave enough to, because you're basically setting up like a new boundary in some sense, right? Because they are used to some kind of boundary in that community, and like suddenly like because you want to take care of certain people, like you're crossing over it. Like when can you do it? Like is it appropriate to do it every time, and are you right all the time?
So Ruth, you sounded like you were thinking about something.
Oh, you can answer Kian's question first.
No, of course I make mistakes all the time. I'm wrong more often than I'm right. And yeah, of course, you don't want to fight every battle every minute. And because it goes back to like, what is your overarching principle, right? Is your overarching principle guarding this boundary, or is your overarching principle creating spaces of relationship that are safe, that foster care for each other beyond, certainly care for each other's illnesses or sickness, care for people who are sick or elderly, also care for the social injustices that someone may be experiencing, care about the pain or suffering that someone is experiencing beyond a healthcare context. So yeah, of course, we want to think about that overarching principle. Sometimes you just let it go. Sometimes, like, in order to care for this person, I'm talking on the phone. There's nobody else can hear me. This person who I know says something. I'm like, oh, really? Ordinarily, that's a boundary for me that I would call somebody on, especially if there was somebody standing nearby. I'm hearing them say, maybe this thing that maybe sounds kind of racist to me, or maybe I'm hearing them say something harmful about somebody that I know. But maybe I know that they're hurting, they're tired, they're stressed, there's something else going on. It's just me and them on the phone. I'm going to take care of them and the relationship in this moment, and maybe not call them on that thing every single moment, and that's also part of care and part of taking care of them. And partly, how much reservoir do you have? Of course, you're not, this is not something we do perfectly every time. And that's, for me, that's the comforting part of it happening in process and across time, rather than just this one thing. It turns out I made a mistake this one time. But when you know people, when you're in a process of relationship, guess what? You're going to get another chance. You're going to see this person again. You're going to have another conversation. You're going to have more opportunities to interact and to say, hey, I love you. Hey, we're friends. Hey, I'm here for you. I've got your back. These things that we do to take care of each other. But that also help to keep each other safe. And so when we think of it as process over time, then we don't have to worry as much about the mistakes that we make as we're trying to build good relationship and good community, good safe and nourishing spaces for each other.
So I think you've already started to answer this question, but as Keelan was saying, there is a sense of like a natural community that we're born into, that we grow up where people are like us, that they act like us, they believe similar things to us. It's important, we believe, as like, you know, members of our church and also members of a body of Christ, and also just Christians who we've been told like it's our duty and our you know, wonderful responsibility to love everybody. But it can be hard, as Kian was saying, to reach out across those boundaries that we set up ourselves, and to make connections across different cultural backgrounds or different viewpoints of how, like, what we value and things like that. I would ask, like, I'm assuming it is important for us to do that, as Christians and as Christ followers. But what are some ways that we can do that, where we can, like, yeah, pass those like biases that we have and reach out and maybe invest in community in a way that would be weird. Maybe reach out to the people who bring turkey to potluck.
Sure. It's hard. It's hard, right? I think people who try to examine this, you know, from a totally natural or secular evolutionary, you know, sort of perspective, that people who are like us are safe, people who are unlike us are dangerous. They're our enemy. Somebody who's going to take our land, or somebody who's going to eat all the food, or somebody who's, you know, in an idea of scarce resources or scarce, you know, scarcity, that somebody we don't know could be an enemy. So yeah, I think it is difficult for us. It is more comfortable to be with people who are like us because we feel safe, we know what to expect. And that's true for everybody. It's true for everybody. Everybody feels more comfortable with the people they know generally, and with who they've grown up with, whether you've grown up in Guatemala, or whether you've grown up in Tanzania, or whether you've grown up in China. You feel more comfortable with the people that you know. Because life, you know, it makes a little more sense. But of course, when we only stay within these safe kind of experiences, it blinds us to other people's experiences. It also means, like, there is a richness, there are ways of seeing the world, ways of understanding relationship, ways of understanding community, ways of understanding God, that that can only be perceived through another language, or through another worldview, or for another cultural history and heritage. So reaching out, stepping out beyond ourselves is good for us. It's good for building community. And I would encourage us to think of it as less of an evangelical effort, to say less, I need to go help them, because once again, we're back to the us and them. But to say, I would say the first step, if you would like to say, okay, I'd like to do something, I'd like to kind of step out. I'm noticing that everybody I know kind of looks like me and does the same things I do. I have a friend who the other day, they're teaching at a university, and I was like talking about, you know, the experiences of people who are maybe struggling with healthcare, and they're like, you know, everybody I know has a PhD. I'm like, everybody you know has a PhD. You need to get some new friends. Like, I mean, because that is the number of people per capita in the United States who have a PhD is small. That is a very small window on the world if everyone you know has a PhD. So, and I would recommend volunteering somewhere, and just prepare to feel a little uncomfortable. I began to learn guitar when I was in my early 30s. And man, I tell you, I paid for lessons, and I didn't pay for lessons for my guitar teacher to tell me, man, you did so good this week. That's great. I paid for guitar lessons so he could tell me, no, you need to do it this other way. This note isn't sounding right. You're going to have to move your finger this other way. You're going to need to attack the strings this other way. Get comfortable with being like, okay, whew, that didn't go smooth as I was hoping, but it's okay. It's okay. It's okay. Look for a place to volunteer. And the reason to volunteer is because you're going to need to learn. You're going to need to learn, wow, this is weird. I don't know how they do it here. I don't know what they mean by this. Man, they keep that there. I wouldn't even think to keep that there. But that way you can learn, and you can be of service in a way that puts you in a context with people that you don't know or aren't familiar with, in a way that can really build relationship in a meaningful way. And I think in a less confrontational way. You know, if you say, I'm here to help, what can I do? It makes a difference.
Is it okay if I process out loud a little bit? Because I've been trying to follow with this whole conversation, and this is wonderful. And I want to make sure that I'm following. So it sounds to me like we can say that in a minimal sense, I am in relationship with everybody in a very minimal sense. And so in a minimal sense, I have a sense of community with everybody. Like that's the way I could like think about it. You know, there's a sense in which there's this string that connects me to them all. But building community will happen to the degree in which I invest myself in relationships. So the process of investing in a relationship is what strengthens that bond of community. So am I following correctly and kind of sort of what we're talking about with that?
Yeah. Yeah, I love it.
And then on the other hand, like with like, you know, getting rid of the us and them and reaching out and everything, I've been hearing people say safety and filling up the empathy and things like that. And it's making me think of this podcast that I've been listening to, hosted by this couple, Lori and Matt Krieg. But they like to talk about like people have these core needs. Like we have these deep core needs that we need to have satisfied. And like one of them is the need to like feel protected. And so like the thought that I've been kind of having is like sometimes these boundaries we set up are boundaries that like make us feel protected. And it's like, so like when the person comes into potluck and they have, you know, the dish that we don't serve at potluck here, suddenly they don't feel they don't feel safe. And so like they don't realize, they think that they're just standing for no, that's not what we do. But really deep down, there's this sense of like safety that's being threatened.
Mm.
And so it makes me wonder if maybe one of the things that helps us to open our arms to more community is if we consciously start stepping back to, wait, what are the core needs that I'm wanting to have protected and filled and nurtured? And ultimately these are needs, like I think you mentioned this at one point, Stacie, like these are needs that can only be filled fully by God. So if my needs are being met by God, and then like through the community around me, like God using the community around me to fill those needs, I will feel more safe opening my arms to investing in relationships with more people.
Sounds great. I like it.
Okay.
Well said. Well said. Go ahead, Stacie.
I was just going to say, I appreciate what you said in terms of, I think there is a deep part there that partly when someone brings turkey to potluck, it's for them, they're just stepping in there, maybe just saying, hey, I wanted to contribute. This is something that I thought I would bring. You know, it's not, you know, it's not an unclean food. It's just a, you know, kind of a moray that we have certainly in North America. So, but the part where this sense of identity that I am a Seventh-day Adventist, I meet with these people, we eat these things, we talk about these things, we do these activities. This is who we are. Mm-hmm. And so part of what's upsetting when someone brings something into that space that is not who we are is it does trouble this idea of, ooh, who are we anyway? You know? And so I would encourage us then, as much as we're talking about, I mean, bearing in mind, of course, we are in a sinful world. There are relationships that are not healthy, that the best thing you can do, the best and safest thing you can do is to not be in relationship with that person anymore. There are relationships, there are communities that are, you know, that are not healthy, that are not safe. There are groups of people who engage in ways that are not healthy and safe. And the best thing that you can do is to leave that, So I'm not saying that you want to always engage no matter what, but what I'm saying is ideally, from an idealized, from a heavenly perspective, if only this could happen, to ground our sense of identity individually. We think about this, of course, in North America, we think very individualistically. So ground your sense of identity. Who am I as a person? Ground that in God first. So then you're like, oh, I made a mistake. Ooh, you know, I don't quite feel like I belong. God's like, you always belong with me. Oh, I made a mistake. I can forgive all your mistakes. I feel really alone right now. No, I am with you. You are never alone. I'm feeling unsafe. Safety is not in the absence of danger. Safety is in the presence of Jesus. Lord, I need somebody. He says, I'm here and I will send you somebody. And there will be a friend, there will be a phone call, there will be a stranger who suddenly, is chatting with you next time. I mean, the Lord will take care. So as from an individualistic perspective, ground your identity in Christ. From a community perspective, and in North America, in the United States, particularly in white North America, we don't think about our identity in community as much. We say, these are my work friends, these are my church friends, we think about that, but we don't identify ourselves as community as much, unless you've maybe if you've lived in a world. I've traveled around so much, so I feel very like I'm so not grounded in community in so many of these ways. So maybe that's why community is really interesting to me, because there's ways that I don't understand it or I long for it. But I think for maybe people who've lived in the same town all their lives, their family, their cousins, their aunts and uncles are around them all the time. This is the air they breathe and the water they live in. They don't even feel it because they're so embedded in this pretty rich, deep community. But to think about community, once again, understanding that, of course, that we live in a broken world. Of course, there are ways that which community is weird and can be dysfunctional, and it doesn't always work like it should. But to say, think about ourselves communally also, rather than this church or that church, or this Adventist church or that Adventist church, rather think of ourselves as children of God. How do we love him as servants of God? How do we serve him? Maybe I'm the foot. Maybe somebody else is the elbow, somebody else is the hand. They look different than I do. If all I ever saw was those two pieces, I would have no idea how they fit together. But to think of ourselves, to recognize our community identity, and the other words might be communal, but that doesn't sound quite right, or collective, but that doesn't sound quite right to my ear either. But to recognize our shared experience as being grounded and rooted in what God desires for us.
I've definitely also been processing the whole time the concept, even while listening to all the great questions and Stacie, wonderful discussion you're creating here. Just repeat the concept of community as process of relationship. Is that how you define it? Process of relationship. So for me, hearing it to begin with and then seeing it develop throughout the conversation with us understanding it, to me it feels very freeing and very empowering, because it tells me that I am an active agent in forming the community, as opposed to being part of a community that is, like, as you said, is not porous and just where I have to fit in a certain way, that I can actually change the community with my interaction and my choices. And so that to me is very empowering. It's definitely reframing. It's a new pattern of thought. And I personally really appreciate that. I guess one of my questions would be, because we are born in communities, we're born in families, but also in communities. And so as we've discussed throughout different episodes, everything is a mix of good and evil. And so our communities support us and help us, but they can also damage and hurt us. And in a sense, I think we can also feel betrayed by different communities. Maybe I'm using the concept here in a more traditional way, and so we grew up with the hurts and these wounds, and yet we function within communities, even forming them, as you're saying. And so how do you navigate that dynamic of healing from our wounds, and from the sense of betrayal in different ways with different communities, and still wanting to be that agent of change, the positive change?
That's a great question. And it's a question I think that's goes right to our hearts, especially if you've been betrayed. I think betrayed is a really good word for what it feels like when your community turns out to be not what you were hoping, or when it turns out not to respond to you in the way that you were hoping. I think betrayed is exactly the right word, and really deeply hurt. It can be very troubling. And I think, let's think about that for just a minute. There's probably several different ways to think about it. Let's think about that for just a minute in terms of these same scales that we were talking about before. And by scales, I mean like different points or sizes to kind of think about. So if we think about it from an individualistic perspective again, and we should, because there are times when we're individually hurt, when we're betrayed, when someone has hurt us or damaged us or crossed boundaries that should not have been crossed. We need healing from that. And absolutely, there may be times when the safest thing and the right thing to do is to get out of that relationship, get out of that community, and hopefully there will be people there to help you. It's a very difficult thing to do all by yourself. but to get out of that relationship where you're not in a place where that's happening anymore. Often that requires a friend. Somebody says, hey, I'm noticing something's going on. Are you okay? And that's an incredible way that we can create a lifeline for someone. And also that lifeline's come to us. I see that this has happened. Are you okay? Do you need some help? So sometimes a friend who's listening, sometimes we may need a counselor. We may need to talk with a pastor. We may need a trained therapist. We may need someone who can, the mind is an organ. Our hearts and minds can be broken in ways. There may be a day when you wake up and man, something is not working quite like it should up there. Maybe because maybe because you're hurt. Maybe because you've recently had a baby and the hormones are not working like they should, and you need some extra help. So absolutely, if there's something on that scale, if there's if there needs somebody to say, look, like I did something wrong, I'm sorry, I hurt you. Or if we need to say somebody else, I realize I did something that was wrong. I realize that I've offended you. Can you forgive me? So when we're looking on that interpersonal level, on that scale, on that very individualistic one-on-one scale of relationship, yeah, there's work that needs to be done there. When we look on a little larger scale, frequently I think we go to the scale of, in Matthew where it says, if your brother offends you, take a couple of the elders, work out. This is a way of communally solving disputes. And anthropologically, there's a long history of looking at how small groups solve disputes. From a very kind of traditionalist sort of perspective, to look at how maybe hunting gathering groups that live in groups of 40 or 50, where there's not a criminal justice system, there's not a leader or a judge. It's a much smaller group. How are conflicts resolved? How are pain or dysfunction or crimes in the community solved on those scales? And what we're seeing in Matthew is a bit of that size. If you have a small group or you have a church and you say, well, what needs to happen? And it can be done on larger scales as well, but typically we're thinking about a smaller group. How do we keep the community healthy? What is the maintenance? What is the regular maintenance that needs to happen on our relationships to keep them healthy and strong, which we say, whew, man, I'm sorry, I was wrong. I made a mistake. Can you forgive me? Man, I really love you, but what you said really hurt me. I was surprised to hear you say that because it hurt me so much and I wasn't expecting it. Sometimes we need to have these conversations, the maintenance that we need to do on our medium-sized communities. And when we think about bigger community, I think there's peace work that's done. And we think about Joan Galtung and the peace work, talking about reconciliation. Sometimes when there's been serious, Rwanda's the quintessential case that people often talk about. What is the truth and reconciliation work that's had to be done in Rwanda to try to bring about some peace? And people like Galtung and people who work in peace and restoration and reconciliation work will say that truth is an essential part of it. How can we heal some of these divides that happen outside of the church? We think about political divides, we think about ethnic or racial divides. You can't have healing and restoration unless you have the truth in there too, unless you've had some honest conversations. And those will have to happen in community in the church as well, in which that reconciliation, that process of maintaining and caring for our community means also saying, as a group, we were wrong. We made a mistake. We're sorry. What can we do to make it right? And where we seek some mediation, and we're on a bigger scale. And of course, this can happen on national scales as well, but on institutional scales, certainly on denominational scales. And like I said, back to Rwanda, where this idea of truth and reconciliation, certainly this has happened in the United States too. I did my dissertation fieldwork in Birmingham, Alabama. There was a committee for the Birmingham Truth and Reconciliation Committee, we came together for a short time, and there were people who had been part of the civil rights movement in the 60s, who had been part of the movement then and who were still very willing to be part of this group later. And they came together for just a short time. It was focused around an event. And but this work of truth and reconciliation for maintaining community, there's process to it. There are steps to it. It doesn't happen magically. I wish it could, but it doesn't happen magically. It does take some regular maintenance on an individual level, on a smaller group level, larger community level, and then on a large scale.
I think maybe it's 7:54. So if there's maybe one more question, we can throw that in. Um, if not, we can move into the takeaways. Any other question? Stacie, I love listening to you. You have such a way of speaking, uh, very important things, but also just the way you're speaking. I could sit here for hours and just listen to you. I really appreciate this new pattern of thought. It's very important that we understand the concept, and I'm so glad we had you to unpack this idea of community for us, especially being season one. We're continuing the discussion with different concepts, but focusing on community again in different seasons. And so I really appreciate that pattern of thought you're putting in our minds. So I guess we could take a few minutes for sharing how has this conversation, what impact does it have on you in the moment? I'm sure there will be much more to come in as we ponder further, but for right now, any takeaways?
So for today's conversation, I really got a lot because I think a lot like Professor Hatfield. I was a missionary child. So I moved a lot. So I have moved like so many times in my life. So there's that same question that I have always have, like how can I get my grounded place of my own community and my belongings? And the more I move, I just figure out that the more it's harder for me to have that ideal community, like the traditional sense of community that I could belong, because I just move too much around the country and different culture across the borders and everything. So the more I move, the more close that I become, like the more protective that I become. And so that's why I was having a really trouble questions about, okay, how should I fix this problem? But then today I really learned a lot in the porous sense of community. And the main idea was that I'm grounded in God and the safety comes from Jesus. So it's after that I can my community is perfect. And I always have imagination of an ideal community that I must belong to. So that's why I work so hard. But I just recognize that it's all about God and Christ first. And then I can move into community.
Mhm.
I feel like I'm in lockstep with Yukyun, because wording it differently, but I feel like it's almost the same point. I'm sitting here and I'm like, okay, the point of this season is God is love, and I'm looking at this and I think about, like, in a way we can almost look at God himself as community with the Trinity, but God is love, and then like the verse that comes to my mind is, perfect love casts out fear. And so like just kind of like bringing all those things together, the idea for me is just like, to the extent that I can experience love, to the extent that I open myself up to love, and the safest place to do that, of course, is with God, to that extent, I will no longer have fear, and I will be able to open myself to love other people. And so I don't know, it fascinates me, and I want to think about it more, like how experiencing love increases your capacity to love.
I resonate with that a lot, because I think that um I hadn't really realized it before. I'm still in the process right now, but the idea that being in relationship with Christ means the broadening of that community. Just by being, I think that's why he says, by this they will know that you are my disciples, by how you love one another. So that by grounding, like Hyun said, by that grounding happening, boom, the community gets bigger, and the responsibility, I think, actually gets bigger, because I think a lot of times it's stressed out, like, I got to protect my people and make sure we're all in line and this, what have you, but the responsibility is still there, but it's so love oriented and so big, and I'm still working through that right now, but that fear of losing security isn't there because that grounding is there. But then the desire and the need to love other people is okay because it's through him and it's in this broader community sense. So I'm still processing right now, but I'm speechless, obviously, but I've really enjoyed this.
Oh yeah, it was such a good discussion. I think for me, some of the most beautiful takeaways are like how simple and profound it is um, to volunteer because you are stepping out of a place where you are comfortable and you know how to do everything. And it's like, it's a way to help, but be like super humbled because you really don't know what you're doing and you have to be taught how to like exist in a community and a culture that's different. Um, and and another thing that I thought was really beautiful was the point that Stacie you made at the end that like you can't have healing and restoration without truth. I think that is super profound, and that you can't have healing and restoration without we're sorry, we were wrong. And I think that is something that I just really want to take to heart, that like if I'm entering into a place that needs restoration, I can help to bring change by being willing to seek for truth and admit that I am wrong.
I think probably along the same lines with me. Actually, I was listening very intently to what you were going to share, Stacie, in response to my question about betrayal. And that word, when you said truth, I was like, wow, because I think I wasn't expecting it. But then after you said it in relation to love in the community, that totally makes sense. Because in God, God is truth and God is love. And so for us to have loving relationships with each other means to have relationships in truth. And we cannot have great, community relationships without truth. Because that would be perpetuating the betrayal in a sense in our own ways. And so I love that. I think obviously how we say that and when we say that, it requires wisdom. But I really appreciate that concept, and really just your understanding of community. I deeply appreciate the way you shared about it. I will take it to heart and will incorporate that in my thinking. I find it freeing and empowering, and I feel like it's kind of a big turning point for me right now, because I learned something incredibly important that empowers me to do things differently in the future, to think of things differently in the future. And so I really, really appreciate that, and I thank you for that. Um, we had a rich conversation, for sure. I can feel everyone. I love it. I wish we had more time, but we're taking home something very important. And for those of us who are watching, this is not the last discussion. It's the second to last discussion of our season. We will have our last conversation on Thursday, March 11, when we will discuss love in the context of leadership, also very important. And our guest on Thursday, March 11, will be Dr. Efrain Velasquez. He's the president of the Inter-American Adventist Theological Seminary. And so we definitely encourage you to attend then as well, or at least at some point watch that discussion as well. And Stacie, the last few minutes are yours to say a few things to our viewers who have been following the discussion. What are your words for them about the concept of love and community?
I would hope for the viewers right now, as you're watching or as you're listening, I would love to know more about your questions, love to know more about what you're thinking. I would love for just a minute longer to savor being in the space with Kayun and with Nicholas and with Adelina and with Ruth and with Mark and with I wish I knew your names, to just take in a breath together, because here in just a second we're going to go separate ways. And this amazing moment of community will have passed, as they do. This is the nature of them. And but just to savor it. And I'm so grateful that each one of you have been here, whether you've listened or watched on YouTube or watched on Facebook or however it comes to you. I'm really grateful for this moment, and I look forward to more of them.
Thank you, Stacie. Heartfelt thank you from all of us. We really appreciate your presence. We hope you come back. We'd love to have you back. And also, of course, thanks so much to Ruth. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Nicola. Thank you, Kian. And to all of our viewers, thank you. We hope to see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.